On July 18, 1877, Thomas Alva Edison wrote in his laboratory notebook, "Just tried experiment with a diaphragm having an embossing point and held against paraffin paper moving rapidly. The speaking vibrations are indented nicely, and there is no doubt that I shall be able to store up and reproduce automatically at any future time the human voice perfectly." As successful as Edison had been with his many inventions, he could never have dreamed how prophetic this statement was. His work that day, nearly a century ago, revolutionized the world of communications and has had an incalculable effect on your life and mine. It all began when he spoke into the mouthpiece of the first phonograph. That recording has long since disappeared, but in 1927, on the 50th anniversary of the invention of the phonograph, Edison repeated for the benefit of newsreel cameras those 22 words that made history.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
In 1871, 6 years before Edison invented the phonograph, a 30-year-old newspaperman named Henry Morton Stanley led an expedition into Central Africa to find the long-missing Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone. When Stanley found the famed explorer, he greeted him with the now famous remark, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Several years later, while visiting Canada, Stanley, by then a well-known explorer in his own right, addressed a few remarks to the President of the United States.
"Mr. President and gentlemen, the best use that I can make of this wonder of the age, the phonograph, is to bid you, on behalf of the citizens of the Dominion of Canada, the most hearty welcome, and to assure you that we are at all times most happy to meet our friends from the United States in the pursuit of science and art and all that may embellish the human life. We bid you a very hearty welcome."
Explorers like Stanley and Livingstone tramped the dark continent to open up new vistas of knowledge. Others roamed the jungles in search of strange and exotic wildlife for animal shows like the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Phineas T. Barnum was America's greatest showman of the 19th century. Renowned for his bold publicity stunts, he rarely missed an opportunity to promote his interests. While visiting London, England in 1890, a year before his death, he recorded his voice for posterity. He also managed to get in a plug for the Barnum and Bailey Circus, possibly the first commercial message ever recorded.
"I thus address the world through the medium of the latest wonderful invention, Edison's phonograph. Know that my voice, like my great show, will reach future generations and be heard centuries after I have joined the great and, as I believe, happy majority." P.T. Barnum.
Another kind of circus, sometimes not too unlike Mr. Barnum's, takes place every 4 years, the presidential campaign. The campaign of 1896 saw Ohio-born William McKinley, the Republican candidate, pitted against Democrat William Jennings Bryan of Illinois. McKinley conducted most of his campaign from the front porch of his home in Canton, Ohio. He advocated a currency system based on the gold standard and a high protective tariff. When Western farmers demanded free silver and the right to pay their debts with silver as well as gold, Bryan took up their cause and attacked the Republican platform in the famous Cross of Gold speech with which his name has ever since been associated.
"The great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. If they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we will answer their demands by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold."
Despite his eloquence, Bryan lost the election. He lost again in 1904, this time to President Theodore Roosevelt, the young, dynamic former Rough Rider from New York. The energetic, positive, and extremely self-confident Roosevelt brought new excitement and strength to the office of president. To the people, he was the trust buster and the man with the big stick. Roosevelt summed up part of his philosophy in the advice he gave to a group of young progressives in 1912.
In this way, I desire to greet the Boys Progressive League at their meeting at the Hotel Manhattan. I feel that the Progressive Party should appeal peculiarly to the young men and therefore to the boys who are to be the next generation of voters. The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States. A square deal politically, a square deal in matters social and industrial. I wish to see you boys join the Progressive Party and act in that party and as good citizens in the same way I'd expect any one of you to act in a football game. In other words, don't flinch, don't foul, and hit the line hard.
While Roosevelt was changing the character of the presidency, the genius of Thomas Edison was altering the very nature of American life. Edison's development of a cheap and efficient electric light and power system in the closing years of the 19th century had led by the beginning of the 20th to such phenomenal creations as the motion picture projector, light bulbs, electric trolleys, irons, fans, stoves, sewing machines, and hundreds of other gadgets and machines that altered our time. In 1908, at the age of 61, Edison spoke on the future of electricity to a convention of electrical engineers.
Ladies and gentlemen, those of us who began our labors at the operator's key 50 years ago have been permitted to see and assist in the whole modern industrial development of electricity. Since the remarkable experiments of Morse in 1844 and the unsuccessful efforts of Field in 1858, there have come with incredible rapidity one electrical art after another, so that in practically every respect civilization has been revolutionized. It is still too early to stand outside these events and pronounce final judgment on their lasting value. But we may surely entertain the belief that the last half of the 19th century was as distinct in its electrical inventions and the results as the first half was in relation to speed. The lesson of the Jubilee of the Atlantic Cable of 1858 is one of encouragement to all who would add to the resources of our race and extend our control over the forces of nature. Never was failure more complete, never was higher courage shown, never was triumph more brilliant than that which since 1866 has kept the old world moored alongside the new by pulsating cables of steel and copper, the family ties of the civilized world. When I look around at the resources of the electrical field today, as shown in this exhibition, I feel that I would be glad to begin again my work as an electrician and inventor, and we veterans can only urge upon our successors, the younger followers of Franklin and of Kelvin, to realize the measure of their opportunities and to rise to the height of their responsibilities in this day of electricity.
Thomas Edison and his associates sought to record the voices of the great men of their time, and they did. Bryan, Roosevelt, McKinley, Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Commander William E. Perry, General John Pershing, to name a few. It's tempting to wish he had come along a little sooner so we might know the voices of Lincoln or Napoleon or Jefferson, and on and on. But the Edison studios turned out masterpiece after masterpiece. Great moments in history, such as this important discussion of the rights of the working man, an excerpt from one of 12 recorded presidential campaign speeches by William Howard Taft in September 1908.
The interests of the employer and the employee never differ, except when it comes to a settlement of the terms of the employment. To give to employees their proper position in such a controversy, to enable them to maintain themselves against employers having great capital. They may well unite, because in unions there is strength, and without it, each individual laborer and employee would be helpless. The promotion of industrial peace through the instrumentality of the trade agreement is often one of the results of such union when intelligently conducted. In order to induce their employer into a compliance with their request for changed terms of employment, workmen have the right to strike in a body, to use such persuasion as they may, provided it does not reach the point of duress, to lead their reluctant co-laborers to join them in their union against their employer, to accumulate funds to support those engaged in a strike, to delegate to officers the power to direct the action of the union, and to withdraw themselves and their associates from dealings with or giving custom to those with whom they are in controversy. What they have not the right to do is to injure their employer's property, to injure their employer's business by use of threats or methods of physical duress against those who would work for it, or by carrying on what is sometimes known as a secondary boycott against its customers. All those who would sympathize with them may unite to aid them in their struggle, but they may not, through the instrumentality of a threatened or actual boycott, compel third persons against their will and having no interest in their controversy to come to their assistance. These principles have for a great many years been settled by the courts of this country.
As strange as it might seem, the man who invented this marvelous talking machine was silent for 42 years. It was 1877 when Thomas Edison recited, "Mary had a little lamb," into a primitive mouthpiece and made the first recording onto a piece of tinfoil, but not until 1919 was his voice known to the public. It was just after World War I when Americans were welcoming home their soldiers from foreign lands. Edison recorded a message to the American people, a recording considered the most accurate reproduction of his voice. He called it, "Let Us Not Forget." An unknown gentleman introduces Mr. Edison.
Thomas A. Edison, the inventor of the phonograph, has never before permitted his voice to be recorded for the public. Today, however, he has a message for you that is important enough to cause him to break his long-established rule. Mr. Edison will now give you that message. I beg to introduce Mr. Thomas A. Edison.
This is Edison speaking. Our boys made good in France. The word American has a new meaning in Europe. Our soldiers have made it mean courage, generosity, self-restraint, and modesty. We are proud of the North Americans who risked their lives for the liberty of the world. But we must not forget, and we must not permit demagogues to belittle the part played by our gallant allies. Their casualty lists tell the story. However proud we may be of our own achievements, let us remember always that the war could not have been won if the Belgians, the British, the French, and the Italians had not fought like bulldogs in the face of overwhelming odds. The Great War will live vividly in the minds of Americans for the next 100 years. I hope that when we do reverence to the memory of our brave boys who fell in France, we shall not forget their brothers in arms who wore the uniform of our allies. I believe that the national airs of France, Great Britain, Italy, and Belgium should for all time to come be as familiar to us as our own Star-Spangled Banner.
In July 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, and during the following hours, through the miracle of electronics, a byproduct of Thomas Edison's inventions, gave us a step-by-step account of his adventure, one of the most exciting events in the history of man. 60 years earlier, in January 1907, a young British explorer, Lieutenant Ernest Henry Shackleton, tramped across the great ice fields of Antarctica to within 97 miles of the South Pole. Like Armstrong, Shackleton was the first man to reach these limits of the unknown. There was no radio communications, no eyewitness on-the-spot reporting of his adventure, an epic every bit as exciting and important to history as spaceflight. But those tense and thrilling hours and days near the South Pole have been preserved for us through the voice of the explorer himself. On a lecture tour of the United States in 1910, then Sir Ernest Shackleton recorded for the Edison Company a resume of his fascinating story. Listen carefully and imagine that you are witnessing a great exploration taking place.
Main results of the British Antarctic expedition of 1907 under my command are as follows. We reached a point within 97 geographical miles of the South Pole. The only thing that stopped us from reaching the actual point was the lack of 50 pounds of food. Another party reached for the first time the South Magnetic Pole. Another party reached the summit of a great active volcano, Mount Erebus. We made many interesting geological and scientific discoveries and had many narrow escapes throughout the whole time. A typical narrow escape was when we were going up the Great Glacier towards the pole. We were marching along, three of us harnessed to one sledge in very bad light. Our last pony was being led by another man with 500 pounds of stores. All of a sudden, we heard a shout of help from the man behind. We looked round and saw him supporting himself by his elbows on the edge of a chasm. There was no sign of the pony, and the sledge was jammed with its bow in the crevasse. We rushed back and helped the man out, and then hauled the sledge out. Then we lay down to have a look, but nothing but a black gulf lay below. The pony may have fallen 1,000 or 1,500 feet. Anyhow, he'd gone. What had happened was this. We, the first three, with our weight distributed, crossed in safety, in the bad light, the bridge over an unseen chasm. The weight of the pony following was too much. It crashed through, but the swingle tree of the sledge snapped, and that saved the sledge. The man leading the pony said that he just felt a rushing sort of wind. The rope was torn out of his hand. He flung himself forward and thus escaped. After this, we four men had 1,000 pounds to pull, and we were unable to pull the whole load at once, so we had to relay. That is, we hauled half our load for a mile, then we walked back a mile, and then we hauled the other half up. So for every mile we gained to the south, we had to cover 3 to do it. And slowly we arose up the largest and the longest glacier in the world, some days spending 12 hours doing 3 miles, other times spending nearly half the day hauling each sledge up by means of the alpine rope. And thus we went along, and thus we returned, having done a work that has resulted in great advantage to science, and for the first time returning without the loss of a single human life. And throughout all this, I was helped by a party of men who were regardless of themselves and only thinking of the good of the expedition. I, Ernest Shackleton, have today, March the 30th, dictated this record.